This problem I've been wanting to solve for almost 12, 13 years was I listen to a lot of podcasts and videos. And so every time I hear something interesting, I take a screenshot. I have like 3,500 photos in my camera roll of just screenshots.
Today's guest is Gene Kim, founder of IT Revolution and best-selling author of the Phoenix Project and DevOps Handbook. In his latest book, Vibe Coding, he's discovered how AI coding has changed software development more dramatically than anything he's seen in his career.
Actually got introduced to vibe coding and loving it so much. Tell us a little bit more your aha moments.
I remember going into ChatGPT and typing in, write a closure program that takes a YouTube screenshot, and it worked the first time. And it used Java libraries I've never used. That would have taken me days. My jaw hit the floor. And then I meet Steve Yegge. He said, like, what problem would you like to work on? I have a pile of these videos and transcripts. How about we make something that can transform those? And we finished in 47 minutes. It's like, man, Gene, you're doing an awful lot of typing. Stop typing. Just lean on the AI more. This has been the funnest thing I've ever gotten to work on in my entire career. The Vibe Coding book tells the story of two people who both thought that their best days of coding were behind them, but is now actually ahead of them. The metaphor we use in the book is you go from line cook to head chef. Your job is not to cut every vegetable, sear every steak. Your job is to help create the systems to allow all these AI agents, these line cooks, to work for you. And it's your kitchen, your Michelin stars. You are ultimately responsible for whatever comes out of the kitchen.
A lot of people can do vibe coding now. Do you think that software developers' role will be decreasing?
If you reduce the cost of software production, do you end up with 1/10 the number of developers, or do you end up with 10 times more software? I just cannot conceive of a world where we're like, oh, we're done writing software.
Hey, quick pause. My goal with Tech Lead Journal is simple. Learn from the best in tech so we can all grow together. If this resonates with you, hit subscribe to follow the channel. It's the biggest way for you to support the show and help us keep bringing great guests and insights to you. Thanks for being here, and let's get back to it. Hello guys, welcome back to another new episode of the Tech Lead Journal podcast. Today, I'm really excited to have one of my favorite authors in the show today. His name is Gene Kim. So he's the founder of IT Revolution and also the co-authors of several popular DevOps books, starting from the Phoenix Project, which I really loved, by the way, when the book came out. So since then, he wrote a Unicorn Project, the DevOps Handbook, Accelerate, and so many other books. And recently, he just published a book titled Vibe Coding with Steve Yegge. So I know that we all have heard about the term vibe coding. Let's try to peel a little bit more from Gene's point of view what vibe coding is. So Gene, thank you so much for this opportunity. Looking forward for our conversation.
Oh, Henry, thank you so much for having me. And I was mentioning how much fun I had listening to your episodes with Simon Wardley, John Willis, and so many of the IT Rev authors. And and the common passion that so many of us have around this kind of the miracles that vibe coding allows us to do, especially for people who maybe stepped away from coding as part of their daily work for years or maybe even over a decade. So I'm so delighted to be here.
Right. So Jen, in the beginning, I always love to ask my guests, maybe sharing a little bit more from your career, right? The turning points that you think we all can learn from you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I've spent the last 26 years studying high-performing technology organizations, and that was a journey that started back in 1999 when I was the CTO and technical founder of a company called Tripwire in the information security and compliance space. And so the journey started when we wanted to study these high-performing organizations that simultaneously had the best project due date performance and development, the best operational reliability and stability in ops, and as well as the best posture security and compliance. So the reason was that we wanted to understand how those amazing organizations made their good to great transformation so that other organizations could replicate those amazing outcomes. And so I left Tripwire in 2010, and I spent 3 years working on the Phoenix Project. That came on 2013. And it was just such a surprise, and I was so grateful that it led me to the middle of the DevOps movement, which I think, kind of upended how technology organizations work, right? It was, dev versus QA versus ops, right? And DevOps is really about how do you get those organizations to work together towards a common objective. And, I had so much fun working with Jez Humble and Dr. Nicole Horstman on understanding what are the technical practices and architectural practices and cultural norms that allow us to, create great performance. And what's kind of funny is that for the DevOps movement, as for that journey, I run Aiden Cockcroft. He led the Netflix cloud transformation. He mentioned a term called no-ops, back 12 years ago. And he recently made a post, on LinkedIn that said, basically, I'm the director of running a bunch of cloud agents. And, 12 years ago, we talked about no ops, and now we should be talking about no dev. And, so no ops is not true back then, nor is no dev true now. But I mean, it just shows how vibe coding is actually bringing, coding within the reach of so many people who haven't coded in years or, even decades. It's been amazing to see how much excitement it generates and how many people are building so many cool things. And I'm sorry, I skipped a step. So the reason I got sucked into this incredible adventure, the adventure of a lifetime, was meeting Steve Yegge last June. And so I've been quoting him for over 11 years. I've had so much admiration for his work. And when we met, it turns out like not only, did we have a common passion on engineering practices and architecture as embodied by the famous, his depiction of the Jeff Bezos memo in the early 2000s, but we had this common love of using AI for coding. And the Vibe Coding book came out a month ago, and I love the book because it tells the story of two people who both thought that their best days of coding were behind them, but it's now actually ahead of them. And this is despite Steve having written over 1 million lines of production code at Amazon for 8 years, at Google for 13 years, as part of having written Cloud Code Search, the most popular tool inside of Google. Anyway, so fun to be able to chronicle how vibe coding has changed our lives, has made things faster, more ambitious. We can do things alone and honestly fun and optionality. I know we'll talk about more about that later, but holy cow, this has been the funnest things I've ever gotten to work on in my entire career.
Before we continue, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Sweep AI. I love my JetBrains IDE, and if you're like me, you know the struggle. When it comes to AI coding assistance, we've had to compromise. Maybe alt-tabbing to other tools, or settling for autocomplete that just doesn't cut it. Well, that changes with Sweep AI. Sweep is built specifically for JetBrains IDE, and honestly, it's been a game changer for me. The autocomplete feels instantaneous. The AI actually understands your code, and there's an agent that genuinely helps you write code faster. Plus, your code stays secure. I finally found an AI that works great in my JetBrains IDE. No more jumping between multiple tools just to get decent AI assistance. You can download Sweep for free at sweep.dev. Thousands of developers at companies like Ramp, Amplitude, Atlassian, and Cloak are using Sweep every day. See for yourself why they're loving it. And now, let's get back to our episode. Yeah, thanks for sharing your story, right? So I'm sure that we will learn a lot. So maybe in the first place, I saw that Phoenix Project was like your first big, popular books, I would say.
Yeah.
And it's written when the DevOps era is, was kind of like apparent. And I'm sure like vibe coding might be the era as well when people are, realizing something big is going to, revolutionize the software engineering industry, right? You have written so many books that has sold over like 1 million copies. So anything that you learn like from people, how did you come up with those books in the first place?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, the Phoenix Project, I had written a book called in 2004 called The Visible Ops Handbook. How to create world-class operational processes using ITIL. Well, things, but like people laughed at ITIL. Maybe these days, but it's like it was the best we had to sort of describe operational processes, and I thought that was very important back in 2004. And a lot of those learnings are brought into the Phoenix Project journey, which was written by the same author team as the Visible Ops Handbook. But in the Phoenix Project is really based on one of our favorite books, which was The Goal by Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt. And so that book is somewhere behind me. And it's a novel about a manufacturing plant manager who has to fix his cost and due date issues in 90 days, otherwise they shut the plant down. And we love that book so much. And Kevin Barr and I, we talked with Dr. Goldratt. I mean, he was so generous with the time, and he changed our careers. And our goal was to see if we can write that book, but for the IT context, for hopeless situation that IT operations is in, if you can't create good working relationships with QA and development. And one of the things that we wanted to show was that IT operations looks so tactical, right? I mean, it looks like it's just a very tactical activity. And yet, if it is what's in between, your most important development projects and your customers, well, then it's actually as strategic as development. And so our goal was to really try to elevate that cause. And I cannot tell you how delighted and honored I was that, that book really became sort of like the flag of which, so much of the DevOps community rallied around. And so we wrote a book called the DevOps Handbook after that, to really be the nonfiction guide, right? The prescriptive guide to say, all right, how does one actually, go from deploying once a year, which everyone did back then, to deploying multiple times a day, right? Or even hundreds of thousands of times a day. Certainly not unheard of now, right? Most great organizations deploy multiple times a day.
Yeah. And I saw recently you also have a series, like a graphic novels, a series of the
Yeah.
Phoenix project. So tell us a little bit more about that project or that book.
Yeah, a couple people just had a tremendous amount of passion for doing that, and it has been really fun to work on. In fact, it's been really fun to kind of go back to the Phoenix Project universe, and it's been really invigorating and fun. And I guess honestly, I'm a little bit in awe of the book just because I'm not sure I could have written that today. I don't think I was as angry, yeah, now as back then, where I just felt like the book really represented like a decade-long plus moral crusade of like getting people to see something, right? And I'm just I'll be honest, I'm a bit in awe of like the way that the story shows that how critical operations is, right? I mean, there was one scene that I remember where it was so good. The inventory management systems went down, the order entry systems went down, and basically it was the whole scene was designed to make sure that everything that was reported on to the board in terms of the quarterly financial report, they couldn't verify account balances or values. And so we're like, all right, what would need to go wrong to basically make sure that they can't count what's in the inventory, what's sold, what's not sold. And I just remember reading that. I was like, man, that is a bad day. and yeah, a lot of that was informed by working with the audit community for so long. Anyway, it was the question was like, how did it feel to go through it? And I was just like, it was really, really fun, and to really work with the graphic artist. He was a DC Comics guy, and so he does a lot of work with storyboarding for movies in the UK. And so it's just really cool to see kind of how critical it is, to as storyboarding is to for any movie. If you can't have a good storyboard, it's very unlikely that you're going to have a good movie because it's often one of the most primary communication vehicles between the director's vision in their heads, right? And all of the with this costuming and the actors or production lighting, right? It's basically that's what is a primary communication vehicle.
Wow, sounds really cool working with a DC comic artist, right? So
Yeah.
I'm sure when if people are interested in reading the Phoenix Project, just text, and now that we have the graphics novel, I'm sure it's gonna be more interesting and fun.
Yeah.
So let's move to the vibe coding thing that we want to talk about today. So maybe in the first place, let's share your aha moments, because in your book you mentioned that you actually got introduced to vibe coding and loving it so much through your experience coding a project that you did, like you didn't even foresee you would work on, right? So tell
Oh
us a little
yeah.
bit more your aha moments.
It's funny. So for me, this problem I've been wanting to solve for almost 12, 13 years was I listen to a lot of podcasts and videos. And so every time I hear something interesting, I take a screenshot of it. And in the hopes that I would go back to it and maybe write about it or listen to it again or write a citation, look something up. And so it turns out I have like 3,500 photos in my camera roll of just screenshots. And how many times have I actually gone back and looked at them and tried to do something with it? It's like 5 because it's so hard. And so I remember when ChatGPT came out, and I was marveling at the way that you could just give it a YouTube screenshot, and it could actually detect what the playtime was, right? And once you have the playtime, you can go into the transcript and you can auto extract a whole bunch of stuff. But for YouTube, often they don't show the current playtime, right? They only show the progress bar, right? And I was like, So I just, as my first kind of non-trivial problem, I remember going into ChatGPT. This is January 2024, and typing in, I'm going to give you write a closure program, right? A program that runs on the JVM that takes a YouTube screenshot, and I want you to march up the left-hand side of the image, find the red, RGB color, and once you find it, march to the right, and so you can compute the percentage complete of the video. And it worked the first time. And and it used Java libraries I've never used. I haven't done 2D programming in 25 plus years. I mean, last time I did it was in C++ on Microsoft Windows. And so I could, and it worked, right? And that would have taken me days, right, to understand, like, all right, how does one use a Java AWT library, blah, 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 right? I mean, it's just not worth it. And the fact that it worked, I mean, my jaw hit the floor, right? And so, I mean, I just, it started reinvigorating my love of programming and just increased the ambition of things that I could actually do reasonably. And then I meet Steve Yegge. Right after we talked, he published the Death of the Junior Developer post. And one of the things and he talked at the conference I run called the Enterprise Technology Leadership Summit about his learning since then. he had made this offer. It's like, hey, how about we pair program together? And so we did that in September, and that just changed my life, right? If someone like Steve Yegge says, let's pair together, you say yes. And he said, like, what problem would you like to work on? And it was easy. It was like, all right, I have a pile of these videos and transcripts and YouTube videos. How about we make something, right, that could transform those into like little video excerpts, with captions overlaid that I could post on social media. And we finished in 47 minutes. I mean, it was just then, the whole time he's giving me advice, he's like, man, Gene, you're doing an awful lot of typing. Stop typing. Just lean on the AI more. And it was, I posted the entirety of the video, but that changed my life. That too changed my life. And, we started talking almost a couple times a week after that. And then, the topic, Steve said that he was interested in writing a book on what became known as vibe coding. Back, we were thinking it was going to be called chat-oriented programming. And I just found, like whenever you finish a book, it takes a little time before you ever want to get involved in another book project. But when Steve mentioned that, I heard the words leaving my mouth, like, I would love to help. And thus began, it was the most fun I've ever had on a book project. I learned so much. And the fact it was happening in this whirlwind of technology change, right, was incredible. But I feel like, and I love some of the people who read it who said, yeah, this is a book that will not change so much with technology. It has a shelf life of at least a couple years, right? And so that's ideally the book we want to write, is that something that just can give the direction, stick the principles and practices, right, that is independent of the technology you use. But I will make it a submission that when Claude Code came out in January, we rewrote the book from scratch. Was it March? Yeah. I mean, basically a lot of the book we had to rewrite just because, that was the future where the AI is not telling you what to do and telling you what to type. You are telling it to do the typing and it to do the running. And that just changed everything for us.
Wow.
In fact, can I tell you a quick story on that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I remember for the book to manage all the research, for most books for the last 12 years, I've been using Trello to sort of like keep track of my tasks and research files and so forth. I just wanted to have everything that I starred inside of Twitter to show up as a Trello card. That worked, but then I actually wanted to summarize the articles and so forth. And I was getting I was trying to create attachments for the first time, and I kept on getting these API errors. And, for 45 minutes, I'm trying this, I'm trying that, I'm asking Cloud Code, I'm asking ChatGPT, and it's like, type this, type that, try this, try that. And I was so frustrated. I said, screw you, you do it. Like you've got a REPL open. And 45 seconds later, it had tried 6 things, and he said, oh, I got it working. And that also changes your life, right? It's like, it makes you recognize, like, your job is not to be bossed around by the AI and type things for it. Your job is to create this situation where it can see the results of its work and it can loop around, right? And it can iterate until you get to the goal. And Steve had a very similar reaction when he was using Puppeteer to do a TypeScript React front end thing, and he described a situation where suddenly it could see what it's doing, and it was like stop motion video where like all the elements were starting to be fixed by itself with no human intervention. And I think we both had a sense of awe right at that moment. It's like, I can't believe what is now possible. Yeah, sorry for rambling, but it's like, it's just so exciting.
Yeah, very exciting to hear, you're sharing, right? Because I'm sure many developers out there, including the, senior ones who probably have loved coding in the past, but they don't have time now to actually start coding again. I'm sure we realize that the power of AI can actually make programming fun again, and you kind of like reinvigorate, your passion for coding, similar to me as well. So I think your story definitely is quite fascinating, right? Especially the impact, right? How you could write such a program that you didn't, think you would do before in just minutes, right? In one day. So I think that's always very, very exciting and eye-opener.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, you talk about eye-opening. I think what's interesting to me, I love the first part of the book because it's just, I think, lovingly written, and it describes, for me, I got my graduate degree in computer science in 1995. I was studying compilers and high-speed networking, and I wrote my last line of production code in 2001 after creating co-founding Tripwire, right? And as someone said that we quoted in the book, I was now in the Pew stack: PowerPoint, Word, and Excel. Right? I mean, and like many technology leaders, right? That's their path, right? And so, although I fell in love with programming again in 2016, it was a tough slog, right? And I mean, everything was hard, and so just to be able to write all these tools that I want to write, like a PowerPoint viewer, a PDF viewer, tools to help the writing process. What did I just write today? I wrote a mail merge tool, right? All these tools that take me less than 10 minutes to build. And so Steve Yegge had the same thing. He actually gave up code. He told his doctor last January that he was done with coding. His hands hurt, right? It was just took too much time, right? And the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. He's been working on this game for 35 years, and he looked at the person centuries of work, and he said it's just not worth it. There's this phrase that he said that's really stuck with me. He said, when you get to be our age, right, in our 50s, you got to be picky about what you work on because there's only so many 5-year projects you have left in you. But after Cloud Code came out, suddenly everything became possible, right? Like something that would have taken a year, maybe might take a week, right? Things that would have taken months might take, days, right? And so that changed, as he wrote, that changed everything. Yeah, it's difficult to overstate just how much it changed our perspective of like, we're not coding again to now we're coding more than ever.
Yeah. So let's go to, the definition of vibe coding. You mentioned that, you had to change the title of the book. Vibe coding was the term introduced by Andrej Karpathy. And since then, people are raving about it. I think your book has some definition that probably not aligned fully to what Andrej's, citations, right? So maybe tell us a little bit more from your perspective. What do you mean by vibe coding?
Yeah, our definition of vibe coding is any time you're coding and not typing by hand, right? And I think so much of this is motivated by and inspired by Dr. Eric Meyer. Oh, so that video that I did in 47 minutes? The video I was using was Dr. Eric Meyer, a talk that he gave last year. So Dr. Eric Meyer, he's probably considered one of the greatest programming language designers of all time. He's part of Visual Basic, C#, very much contributed to Haskell, Link. He was behind the Hack programming language at Meta, where it's a type-safe version of PHP. And he said the days of writing code by hand are coming to an end. And it's just like, it just it made us it gave us confidence, right? That it's like, if he can say it, someone who's spent his entire career designing programming languages to be used by humans, what would make him say that the days of writing code by hand are coming to an end? And I think it's because he believes very much the same things that we believed. And he was very much like the totem in our book. And so then when Dr. Karpathy introduced the word vibe coding, brought it to the universe in late December, we definitely we thought that gave voice to what we're trying to do. And so Dario Amodei, the CEO and co-founder of Anthropic, he wrote the foreword to the book, and he gives this wonderful definition. He said, we don't write code by hand. Instead, it comes from iterative conversation with the AI, and the AI is writing the code for you. And I thought it was just and he said, on the one hand, it's a very wonderful term because it evokes how different it is and like hunching over a computer and typing things out. But he said, on the other hand, it's kind of a terrible term because it sounds kind of jokey, like not a serious endeavor. But he said, at Anthropic, it's like the only game in town. And I just thought it was such a great definition. And so, our definition is like anytime when you are not typing out code by hand, which is like developing photos in a dark room, right? Where you actually go into a dark room and you have to dip into the chemicals. So no one does that anymore. And I think even since the book has come out, Steve and I have talked a lot to each other about like how we're writing so much more, creating so many more things. And we have such confidence. We've gained such confidence in what the AI can generate, and we're very cognizant of what it's bad at, right? But with the right engineering mentality, with the right feedback loops, with the right architecture, it is possible to do things safely.
Right. Interestingly, some people don't even type the prompt these days. They will just transcribe
Oh,
as a transcription tool, and it's like writing code through the conversation with a computer with the AI itself.
Oh my gosh, yeah! I was just got off a call with John Rouser. He's a senior director of security at Cisco, a senior director of engineering at Cisco Security. And so he convinced his SVP to basically mandate 100 of the top leaders vibe code something and put it into production within a quarter. So that ended 11 days ago. And so trying to generate a survey like we did in the early days of the state of DevOps research to understand, all right, how did it feel like? What did you accomplish? I want to know what the vector is. What was did they have an aha moment? So vector is a direction and a magnitude. So I want to understand, like, to what degree are they excited and what are they going to do, right? The direction. I started in ChatGPT saying, all right, here's kind of the survey instrument I want to design, right? Here's kind of the vague idea of the instruments. And it was interesting, but then I put it into Claude Code and said, read all this, right? Create a one pager of the survey design, and it showed me something. I'm like, not quite. Yeah, like, and then just through conversational iteration, after 5 rounds, I had something I was ready to show John, and we were so excited. And then I was like, okay, take a first cut of the questions, and and it's just so different than the way we did it 12 years ago, right? And obviously, I'm gonna go in there, and I'm gonna, this is we're gonna have 100 people spend time, maybe 15 minutes going through the survey. So I want to make sure that it's right, that it counts, that it can take us and hopefully generate some interesting research findings. But I'm responsible, right? But am I actually writing every question by hand? Am I making every Likert question on a scale of 1 to 7? To what degree do you blah, 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 blah? No. And it's just amazing to see, like, it's not just coding, right? It's just even survey design and survey analysis. It's just amazing how much AI can help you.
Yeah. In your book, you mentioned this term FAAFO, right, as the benefits of vibe coding. So you
Yeah.
mentioned a lot of things, making programming fun, obviously faster generation of code, right? So FAAFO kind of like summarize the things that people could benefit by using, AI and vibe coding. So tell us a little bit more about this FAAFO, because I'm sure some people might not, realizing the other elements of FAAFO apart from the
Yeah.
fast and the fun part. Yeah.
Oh, exactly. I just, Steve and I, we did a lot of thinking around December about, how do you articulate the value of it? And we came up with the FAFO construct, which we get endless delight out of. And interestingly and conveniently, the first dimension is faster. And our claim is that that is actually the least interesting dimension of value. But there's no doubt that, like, whether it's the YouTube percentage complete generator or whatever, like, AIs let you do things faster for sure. But I think far more powerful is the notion of ambitious, is that you can now do things that you could not have done before, right? And I think there's actually two parts of the spectrum for this. Take that video excerpt generator. It might have taken me 3-4 days if I'm feeling kind of generous, right, and confident. But I like anytime you work with FFmpeg, things take longer, right? I mean, it's like the simple things can be very, very difficult. And so I think if you ask, why have I never generated the video generator, despite the fact that it only took 47 minutes using AI, I think an economist would say that I was making a conscious or unconscious decision that the juice wasn't worth the squeeze, right? The effort wasn't worth the return. It's not worth 3 days, right? This other thing I should be working on. But when it takes 47 minutes, right, suddenly that changes everything. Like, suddenly the impossible becomes possible. I think that's the really point of ambitious. The other thing that's really interesting is that the small things become free. The Claude Code team talked about, like, one of the things they're counting is how many times does a customer issue come up, and they just fixed it on the spot. They don't create a Jira ticket and then debate about it and, like, prioritize and triage it. They just do it. And I think that is also very interesting, right? So, like, impossible becomes possible, and the small things become free, especially we can launch a whole bunch of agents in parallel. And so that just fundamentally changes the economics of software. So you got faster, you got more ambitious, and you got, autonomous and alone. One of the things I find so exciting doing these vibe coding workshops, is that everyone has things they want developers to do, but it's just not above the line. And so, like, so you got software leaders, you got designers, you got UX people, like, they're just pestering developers to try, please solve this problem for me, right? Or the Tableau people or somebody, right? Someone, is they want something done, but they you have to sort of cajole and politic and escalate, to get these things done. And suddenly you can do them by yourself. Or, maybe it's a team and you've been trying to get this other functional specialty to help. And, suddenly you don't need the CI/CD expert or the Kubernetes expert. You can just do it yourself. And that significantly changes, again, the economics of software, because there's two costs that are being lessened. One is the coordination cost. In other words, you don't have to prioritize and synchronize and agree on priorities and then code together, deploy together, test together, right? You can do it yourself. And the other one is, like, even if you get someone else to believe that a problem is as important as you think it is, they can't read your mind. And it turns out these LLMs are so good at intermediating, between multiple parties. to work together. And then so like both of those I think allow autonomous and alone. And so that's FAA. F is the second F is for fun. Like, oh my gosh, there's something very addictive about vibe coding. In fact, have you found that like once you're vibe coding creating things, it's very difficult to stop?
Yes, yes, it is. Especially once you can see, I mean, coming back to the ambitious thing, right? Once you can see the possibility and
Yeah.
the amount of things that you can do in such a short time is very addictive, definitely.
Oh my gosh, yeah, and yeah, so like creating something that you had in your head and it's working. I mean, it's just incredible. And like even the unfun things become sort of fun, like reducing test times, like injecting test data into a function so that it's not hitting a database. Like even that's fun, right? It's just yeah, and it just shows there's a dopamine release that is, I think, very addictive, and good or bad, that changes the dynamics of how we create software. And I'll take fun any day over boring or tedious or like maddening. So that's awesome. And the last one is option value. You can explore so much more of the decision space. You can try, 3, 4 ideas where, you'd be before, you'd be lucky if you can get one. And it's so expensive and unhappy making that you're just kind of stuck with it. So just recently I tried something 3 ways. What did I do? It was like, oh, I need to increase the time to first render. Like, let's try one time by delaying the generation of the Vega light. Let's try another one by something, something, right? And I just set them all off in parallel. And, after some exploration, I decided to choose one of them. And I don't, I don't even remember what it is. Anyway, so like option value is actually what allows, they say it is actually a huge creator of economic value. In fact, option value is what allows modularity to be so powerful. And so there's just no doubt that, the more variations that you can try, ideally in parallel, right? That is just one of the biggest levers for economic value creation.
Yeah. And I would say also optionality doesn't mean that all the options come from your head, right? But AI
Oh,
itself can actually gives you more options such that you can
yeah.
think which one is best for your situations, right?
Yeah, totally. Right. It is on the one hand, like you have an infinite army of summer interns, but it also is your world-class expert in almost every category, right? And it is what an amazing tool to have.
Yeah, you mentioned that a lot of people now can create, ambitious projects. Even you saying that small things now could be free, or people, non-coders can actually solve issues. And obviously, some people have these concerns, right? So when a lot of people can do vibe coding now to generate software and create, code, do you think that software developers' role will kind of like be decreasing, or do you think also like more people would become a coder, so to speak, right? A vibe coder. So tell us a little bit more on this because so many people have different perspectives on this, and I would love to hear from you what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I was just earlier talking to Dr. Jeffrey Liker. So he wrote the Toyota Way. I mean, just very famous in the lean circles. And he actually said, "Gene, you're confusing me. On the one hand, you say that it's just a typewriter, right? I mean, it's helping you do all these things, right? And you also say that it is capable of helping you be creative and so forth. Like they seem contradictory." And I was like, "No." Dr. Liker is like, "No, no, I don't see them as contradictory at all." And because to him, coming from the manufacturing space, I mean, I think when he hears automation, the magic typewriter that can type, 10,000 words a minute, that's reduction of jobs. And I think what I was trying to convey to him was that, the notion of Javon's paradox, the notion that if you reduce the cost of software production, do you end up with 1/10 the number of developers or do you end up with 10 times more software? And in my head, I just cannot conceive of a world where we're like, oh, we're done writing software. We just we've had our appetite filled and we don't need any more software. I cannot conceive of that possibility at all. And so to me, what that means is that we're going to end up with more developers and solving bigger problems. And the people who will be doing coding will be actually much broader than the 28 million developers we have on the planet right now. I mean, it will be anything adjacent to developers like QA and operations and UX and product and design and so forth. Yeah, am I 100% certain that it's a good times ahead? Not entirely, but I feel like the notion that somehow we're not going to need developers anymore. I just find logically impossible. Does this say that some wrong-headed leaders are going to say we're going to cut 20% of developers because we don't need them anymore? I'm sure that's going to come. Like, that's assholes like that, I've always been around and they're going to suffer the consequences. But yeah, I think the right-headed leaders will realize, we need developers more than ever.
Yeah, in fact, so many organizations are thinking, by introducing AI, we will be able to kind of like cut a number of people that we have. And obviously, the layoffs that are happening in some organizations probably due to that. And I think soon or maybe later, they will realize that, oh, probably we cannot just cut developers because we still need developers. And like what you mentioned, the amount of software, if it gets written by a lot, right? Obviously, sometimes that when there are issues or you want to change, evolve the software, you will need more developers to help you. But this time, probably a better developer that has a good skill, right? Rather than a developer that just do the mundane tasks. So I think that's a very important thing to realize as well.
Yeah, in fact, I was talking to Roto at John Deere. Apparently, he is the number one token consumer inside John Deere, and I think the GitHub team told him that he might be in the single digits of top token users on the planet, which is amazing. But yeah, he said, yeah, developers we're craftsmen, we're craftspeople, right? It is a tool, and the tool is only as good as the person using it. And so AI is great for juniors, but like what seniors need to do is like every mistake that they're making, somehow we need to make it impossible for juniors to make the same mistake because like to really get great leverage out of it. Like not everyone can be a senior, right? If everyone has to be a senior developer to get value out of it, then like we're not there yet.
Yeah. So maybe in terms of the downsides, because we just talk about the benefits, right? So I'm sure you have seen in the news as well, the downsides of vibe coding, production database gets deleted, things that should be private becomes public, and so many other things, issues. So tell us a little bit more, some downsides, because I'm sure there's a risk of vibe coding too much, especially if you don't check the code that gets generated. So tell us some of
Yeah.
these things so that we can kind of like manage our expectations better as well.
Oh yeah, yeah. So there are definite downsides for using AI for coding. I mean, it is well known that there's like significant limitations. They are one of them is like context window limitations, right? It's like unfortunately, and it is true that the more you put into the context window, not only if you get to a certain point, it won't accept it, but the dumber they get. There's actually this benchmark that shows it's called Fiction Bench. That you give it a story, and then you ask questions like, "What happened to the character, between chapter 2 and chapter 7?" And it turns out like this paper was from a year and a half ago. Even above 3,000 tokens, like performance degrades significantly. So it's just really interesting to know that if it can't even follow a character in a modern like novella, if it can't do that, then you should have don't trust it. That's a limitation that's going to hit you when you're trying to code as well. Another one is like AIs are actually bad at instruction following. There are so many times when you tell it to do something and it will forget, or it will, it will change the meaning of the instructions. And then there's actually something called like it's actually prone to hacking its reward function. In other words, AIs are trained to be helpful, right, and completing tasks. And often, like as the context window fills up, it will almost start to panic and just say, "Okay, I'm done. I've made all your tests pass," but it doesn't tell you that's actually disabled. The way it did it was disabling a whole bunch of tests. Like we highlight a whole bunch of disasters that happened to us. One is Steve had 80% of his unit tests deleted one time, and only found out like a week later when his colleagues told him. I've created haunted code bases that were impossible to understand, impossible to test, and almost impossible to rewrite. Steve's had, in fact, I've almost had entire repos disappear. In fact, Steve tells a story about like the only surviving link to a repo, containing weeks of work, thousands of dollars of tokens of work, was in one window. And had he closed that window, the inode would have been disappeared and the garbage collected away, and like it would have been all gone. I've had it corrupt production databases. You might be asking why will it give it production access, because like it's so helpful. Right? It's like oh my gosh, I once asked it to the Google Photos API. They deprecated something. In other words, you couldn't retrieve photo screenshots that it didn't upload. And so they basically, it was useless to me. I was relying on that for over a decade. And so I said, hey, go into my Apple Photos SQLite database and just rummage around and see if you can, give me a way to download, the full size image. And that was scary, startling, awe-inspiring, amazing, but scary. Anyway, it's just there's sometimes where I just decided to take a risk, right? Because there's something I really, really want. The lesson we try to give in the book is that as an engineer, you have to be aware of these limitations. And as an engineer, right, where it's all about what engineers do is we create reliable systems out of unreliable technologies, right? That's what cloud was. That's what Amazon S3 was, right? Kubernetes, right? Same thing. You create the illusion, that you have a long-lived, container image running in production, that you don't have to worry about things failing. And so I think it's all about, in the book we say, it's all about taking all your same engineering instincts, but then turning up to 11. There's this thing called the Nygaard stability criterion that says the control mechanism must be faster than what it's controlling. And so when your code generation time goes up by 100x, your control systems have to go up by at least 100x. And so suddenly you're coming into version control more. You are relying on tests more. You have to have more modular systems because you can't let small problems become huge problems. You want to be able to contain and isolate them. So all, these are not new, but as we put in the book, like if the fastest you've ever gone is like 15 miles an hour on horseback, and someone gives you keys to a car and says go 50 miles an hour or 500 miles an hour, you will wreck the car. And we write in excruciating details how many times we wrecked the car, like how our instincts failed us, and like the new instincts that we need to replace it with. So yes, there's definite downsides, but we believe that the same engineering principles that we've learned over the last couple of decades, we just need to speed them up even more to create faster feedback earlier, more frequently, and stronger, because you need to know when things are about to go off the rails. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, especially if you don't check the output, right? And if you give it a big prompt such that, it can generate tons of code. Obviously, there's a lot of dangers in doing that, and especially just accepting and move on. And people these days also have this, auto accept. they don't
Yeah.
even check, the iteration that the AI agents are doing. So definitely there are a lot of dangers. And I love when I read about this hijacking reward function that you mentioned in
Yeah.
the book, because there are so many things that you need to understand, kind of like I don't know, like the behavior of AI, the philosophy of AI, right? You mentioned that AI tries to be helpful all the time, even though it can cheat. It can
Yeah.
achieve that by cheating, right? So I think that's very fascinating when I read that. So you also mentioned that now we have to put a lot more guardrails. Developers' job probably is changing, shifting, right? It's not just the writing of the code, but now becomes like a head chef, you mentioned in your book, right? So tell us some of these transition things that all developers must be aware of, because I'm sure the role itself is changing a lot with AI. And what are the important skill sets that we need to invest in order to become a much better developer equipped with AI?
Yeah. The metaphor we use in the book is you go from line cook to head chef, right? Your job is not to cut every vegetable, sear every steak, right? Your job is to help create the systems to allow all these AI agents, these line cooks to work for you. And I guess what I love about the metaphor is that we're saying that, as it's your kitchen, your Michelin stars, right? You are ultimately responsible for whatever comes out of the kitchen. So if someone gets food poisoning, right? If you get a health code violation, right? It's not the AI's fault, it's your fault. And I just love that because it extends to whether it's a small kitchen with one or two helpers to a large kitchen with 20 helpers, or maybe it's a chain of restaurants with hundreds of people who are all part of this endeavor. It's interesting. At the conference we had Stuart Pierce. He's a group CTO of HG, so they're a private equity firm. He was saying that he's met so many senior leaders, senior engineers, who he could just sort of tell if they're going to be great vibe coders or not. And he said it was like two things. One was like, are they good at specification? Are they good at delegation? And are they willing to jump in to finish the last 5% if the AI can't get right? And I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of I found that familiar. I was talking to another friend of mine, Jason Cox, that he's a executive director at Disney, and I told that to him, and his eyes lit up. He said, yeah, you know what? There were a whole bunch of engineers who were very resistant to vibe coding, and so he pulled their performance reviews, and he said the single theme that kept on coming up over and over again was, we want to give you more responsibility, but you need to delegate more. And it was just like, and so delegation is a teachable skill. And so I think, again, I love these anecdotes that I really do believe are, there's a basis for it. And I think kind of through benchmarking, I think we're going to find these kind of predictors of whether people are going to be good at it or not, right? And what are the skills that need to be taught to take full advantage of this amazing new technology. Yeah, so head chef, I think what it means is that sensibilities that I think become more important than ever is, are you creating a system that has very effective feedback loops where when something goes wrong, you get fast feedback right away. It's a strong signal. You can stop the line and you can fix it. Or are you creating a system that has very weak signals and you're not paying attention anyway, and you're just letting accept all, dangerously, allow anything, you're going to have a bad time. I think another sensibility is like architectural sensibilities. I mean, are you creating a system that agents can work on in parallel without interfering with each other, right? Or are they all snarled together, and every time you try to commit, you end up with these horrendous merge conflicts, which has happened to me more often than I like to admit. And what's interesting is that now you're spending all your time not doing cool things. All you're doing is like unsnarling, uncoordinating, coordinating, recoordinating, and that's not good. And so just those same sensibilities that work for people, also apply to AI. And then I think another thing is like you have to love learning. I think some people get energized by the rate of change in what's happening with coding agents right now and so forth. Other people get frightened and sort of dig their heels in. And I think it's fun to be part of the first group. I think we have to have sympathy for the second group because eventually, right, we want them to be a part of the ride, right? As Steve said, this is the big one, right? Kind of like imagine you're in Hawaii and the big wave is coming. You got to get ready, get the surfboards out, practice so you can not just ride the big wave, but survive the big wave, right? And then the last one that we say that you need to do is you have to love to cook. You have to love creating things, right? If coding is just a job and you're just sort of punching a ticket, maybe vibe coding is not going to be the most fun for you.
Yeah, so I think those are very important skills indeed. I'll just try to summarize it, like faster feedback loop, right? And I think in fact it becomes much more important simply for the guardrails reason that you mentioned, and then modularity, the architecture thing definitely
Yeah.
makes sense because you still want to come up with the code that is designed well because the code will evolve unless you are building like one-time project where
Yeah.
once you use it, that's done, right? And then embrace learning. Definitely these days it can be very overwhelming. Sometimes I feel overwhelmed as well, like so many rapid advancements happening. And sometimes you need to be patient as well about learning those new things. Lastly is mastering the craft, right? Like you need to learn like how to enjoy your role, right? Like become a
Yeah.
problem solver, writing software and things like that. So I want to dive a little bit on the faster feedback loop because I feel feedback loop is such an important thing. In the past, when in the DevOps world, especially like with CI/CD, automated tests, and all that, feedback loop is very important to give you like signals where you're heading to. Either are you heading to the right direction or wrong direction? Now with AI, you mentioned that you are given like a very fast car. Things are churned out very fast.
Yeah.
Without fast feedback loop, I think it's much more dangerous. So tell us about the importance of this feedback loop. And you have this new cycle that gets introduced, like prevent, correct,
Oh,
and detect, those kind of things. So maybe tell us a little bit more about these techniques such that developer can benefit from that.
yeah. Oh, so I feel like my entire career, it's gotten me ready to write this book. Yeah, and so I got to work on a book called Wiring the Winning Organization with Dr. Steven Spear. And so he is famous for many things, but among the things he's famous for is writing the most widely downloaded Harvard Business Review article of all time called Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System. And I remember reading it in 2001 and just thinking like, this is amazing that, he talks about how in any Toyota manufacturing plant, there are thousands of people working in a community of scientists doing experiments every day and continuously learning. And that's enabled by feedback. And so feedback, whether you're making cars or launching a rocket or performing a surgery, you have to see what you're doing, and it's not like one screenshot, per operation, right? It's like you want to see what you're doing at any given point in time. And so it turns out like feedback is like one of the most critical things in any management system, but also like in any engineering endeavor. To go into that Nygaard, there's something called the Shannon-Nyquist theorem. The provenance of this is not quite clear to me, but there's something that says the controller must operate at least twice the rate of what is controlling. And I think the Nyquist-Shannon theorem actually says, for measuring something, you have to sample at twice the frequency, right? Which I think is like, you can correlate, then the corollary is control it. You have to be able to, measure it, et cetera. And so like what we did in the book is that, all right, how do we have to modify our inner, middle, and outer development loops, to use this amazing new technology? And, we had some reviewers say, you're actually breaking how a usage of a term, right? Inner is kind of like what you do on your laptop. Outer is what you do in CI/CD. It's like, yeah, you know what? It's just, it is. Yeah, we'll go there. I mean, it's just, you have to change the way you work. And the way we define it was inner is like, what do you have to do kind of like every second, every minute to prevent, detect, and correct bad things from happening. And then middle is, what do you have to do every hour or days, and outer loop is maybe days or weeks. The certain practices, are like, all right, you got to checking stuff into more version control more frequently. Whatever you're doing, you're probably going to be at least 2 to 5 to 10x more frequently. It's funny, Steve Yegge, he allows his coding agents to check in code all the time. And I just found, like, for me, I let it do it sometimes, but I really want to be the arbiter and decider about what gets in and what isn't. There are sometimes emergencies where I do let it do it. But for me, version control is my ultimate fallback. And I don't want to, I just need to keep that clear in my head. Another one is, yeah, like you have to be aware of tests. Like the idea that you have to have situational awareness. You have to know what branch you're in, what window you're in, what project you're in. Those are critical signals you need, because how many times, kind of having a recall moment here, where you type in the wrong prompt in the wrong window, right? And so anyone who's done like server admin knows what it feels like to drop a table when you thought you were in staging, but you're actually in production, right? I mean, had similar moments inside of Cloud Code. Yeah, so there's certain things you got to do, like always front and center, like literally every second. And there are things that you need to be doing kind of less frequently, but just as important. And where did that term come from? It actually came from the audit community. Like, what are all the bad things can happen? And we know from personal experience, what are those bad things? So now you need controls to either prevent that bad thing from happening. And if it does happen, you need to have detection and correction mechanisms. And so we have a whole section on like, the catalog of practices that we built up, all the disasters that we just talked about. How do you prevent, detect, and correct?
Yeah. So I think one key insights here is like your controls must be in place, right? And in fact, it must be greater than in the past, because now when code is very cheap to produce, you need more controls to kind of like detect, right? If there's anything going wrong, missing, or whatever that is, right? And how to prevent that, and how you correct that after that, right? Sometimes the developers need to be hands-on in order to be able to correct that.
Oh, very.
So,
yeah.
So the last part of this conversation, I want to talk a little bit more, because vibe coding, a lot of the discussions these days is more, on developer individuals, right? Like everyone now can, vibe code. But I think the big potential is actually to make vibe coding more kind of like a cultural thing in an organization. And in your book, in the last few chapters, you also mentioned like how can organization adopt vibe coding as part of their culture. So I know this is probably a little bit more advanced for some organizations who are still trying to adopt AI, like the chat AI or some kind of other AI tools. But vibe coding itself can be a powerful thing for organization to actually innovate a lot more and produce something, that is more innovative. So tell us, how can we start creating this vibe coding culture? What are the important things to set?
Yeah, I don't know, but I mean, I think the way we learn is by people sharing experience reports, which is the reason why I've been running this conference for last 12 years. Yeah, and it was, I'll just share some of the highlights that kind of really blew me away. One was a guy named Sri Balakrishnan. He's a head of technology and product at Travelopia. So it's a $1.5 billion a year travel company. And he was talking about how they were able to rewrite a Drupal application in 6 weeks, right, with a very small team of people using AI tools. They only had the code, no documentation, but they did have the users, and they were able to reconstruct all the screens needed to, basically do everything outside of the mainframe. Amazing. They rewrote the payment platform, and there was like a race between kind of a typical dev team and a dev plus AI team. And, the way he described it was the dev team, no AI, was kind of this linear one. Dev plus AI was more flat, but then it kind of hockey sticked at the 6-week mark. They matched the progress of the manual dev team. But he said the most important thing is that the only team that was willing to go into production was the dev plus AI team. And then they basically shut down the race after that. A company called Exabeam, the head of product, he described how, among many other things, they're a private equity owned firm. And they said, the classic playbook is that you find an aging competitor or competitor adjacent, and then you acquire them for $100 million. And then, you grow the company that way. And he said, we did an experiment. We got 8 people together. We decided to, instead of buying the company, which, has balance sheet implications, we're just going to find an aging competitor and see if we can create an MVP of exactly what they do. And so the verdict isn't out yet, but they said we learned so much. That we got so much further than we thought. And the notion that product owners, designers can contribute to a coding project was just so much higher than they ever thought. The big challenge was, how does this product manager get someone to review their code when they don't have those relationships when you're not in a dev team? Which was illuminating. And one thing that Sri talked about was like, he has a real sense that the team size is not going to change. It's not going to be 8 people anymore. You don't need 6 developers plus the UX plus product. You just need a person with a problem and a developer who can fix it, right? And maybe a pair of those two can actually go further and faster. That's super exciting. But like one of my favorite presentations came from Dr. Topo Pal, who I've known for over a decade. He's a VP of architecture at Fidelity. And among one of the applications he's responsible for is this application where you ask, which of our 20,000 plus applications have Log4j in it? Who's the responsible manager, which business unit, and so forth. And he's had this vision of what this application should be in his head. But whenever he asked his own dev team, like, what would it take to build it? They would say 8 months. And plus we need a front end React person, right? And he got so frustrated that he decided to write it himself. He spent the whole weekend vibe coding. 10 days later, right, he had something that followed all of the Fidelity coding standards, of which he's partially responsible for, and it went into production last month. The question is, all right, who's going to maintain it? Who's going to help Topo build the next set of functionality? And her name is Swati, the most junior engineer, because all the senior engineers are like, no, thank you. And the surprising thing is he's getting more headcount because the number of people using this tool is so much broader than what it could do than before. And so, like, who saw that coming, right? So, and he's saying the teams who are vibe coding, some of them are saying for 20 plus years or whatever, however that long they've been using kind of Scrum-like patterns, we've always been able to demo everything we need to demo every 2 weeks. He's now consistently, there are some teams who don't have time to demo everything they built. And now they're asking, do we need to have these demos more frequently? It says, it just opens up so many questions. And I think that's all very exciting. I mean, it's not boring. So yeah. And then plus John Rouser, right? He's presenting tomorrow about what happened when 100 leaders within Cisco security all have to vibe code. And so, the survey instrument that we were working on is really designed to say, all right, who is the most excited, right? Who is like, we called it super forward or something, like the early adopters, enthusiasts, the partial completers did not complete. What are the critical enablers that allowed the high performers to be high performers? And what are they going to do about it? Given all these aha moments, how do they want to change the way, their engineering teams work? I can't wait to learn.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned like the juniors now is being able to kind of like be part of an active problem solver maybe in the organization. And this I think also comes back to how you hire, right? What are important traits these days that you think we should look when hiring developers? Because now that everyone potentially can write the same, amount of code, maybe the same quality because AI is kind of like the leveler here. So what are the important skills to look at when you hire?
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, I was at the Grace Hopper celebration last week. So that was 14,000 women in technology. And I've never been to anything like it in my life. It was people across all parts of the, career stages, college students, researchers, senior leaders. And like, I don't think anyone knows, but I'll tell you what it really caught my attention. A couple of students, they asked, is what I'm learning here in university still important? And I'm like, I don't know. But I do feel like, and we put in the book some suppositions, and this mostly came from Steve, but I actually agree wholeheartedly. It's like, do we really need to be teaching data structures this much? I mean, is it really a semester's worth of work, or is it like a couple weeks, right? I mean, I don't think very many people these days are going to be writing, certainly not linked lists or complex B trees, right? It's like, I don't think that's as relevant, but I think we need to be teaching more, right? Things like software architecture and how to create dynamic feedback loops and, tools like, how do we use tools like vibe coding? Yeah, it's super interesting. And I just, one of the things that we put in the book was, if we expect developers to be using AI to solve problems, well, then shouldn't we want developers to be using AI as part of the interview process? And so, there's a whole bunch of reasons that, if you have to be air gapped and, working on something sensitive and classified, well, then you've got to learn how to work on stuff without it. However, right? I mean, if the majority of problems will be AI assisted, well, then maybe that's the way we should be interviewing as well. But then I totally understand the risks of like, all right, you're not actually hiring, you might be accidentally hiring an AI and not a person. So, which is the thing.
Yeah, hiring an AI paying for a human salary. So I think
That's right.
another worse. So, Jean, it's been a pleasant conversation. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up pretty soon. I have one last question that I'd always love to ask my guests, right, to learn from you. So, I call this the three technical leadership wisdom. Just think of it like an advice you want to give to the listeners here. So, maybe if you can share your version today, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll give one that's AI specific and one that's not AI specific. So I think AI specific, something that Dr. Ron Westrom, who so much influenced our work in the Accelerate book, DevOps Handbook, around cultural norms. He introduced me to the term the socio-technical maestro. And basically, he says really five things: high energy, high standards, great in the large, great in the small, and they love walking the floor. And so, yeah, high energy, high standards, that's obvious. Great in the large, that means, to me, systems thinking, being able to see the larger picture. Great in the small means like, yeah, you're detail oriented, right? Care about, you don't just believe anything that people tell you, right? You're willing to sort of dig on the covers and really find out. And then love walking the floor, right? You love, when you're responsible for the work of others, you go to where the work is being performed. You actually see what's in their way. Are you really creating the conditions, to enable people to do their work easy and well? I think people, engineers, leaders we all need leaders, right? Any endeavor that takes more than one person, we need leaders for. I think the second thing that I would add that's not AI specific is like, what is one piece of advice I would give to people early in their careers? And I would say, find someone with lots of problems, right? Someone's working on important problems and they can't solve all of them. And I think what I found in my career, in fact, where Tripwire came from was me going to Professor Gene Spafford. And he had a lot of research and funding, and he had lots of problems and projects he wanted to complete. And I was free labor as an undergraduate student, and I got to work on graduate level problems. And one of them became Tripwire, which became the foundation of a company that I was there for 13 years. And we did our filing to go public. And I'm just incredibly grateful for that experience. And I think so often, right, that's what it comes down to is like, especially early in your career, you don't know really what you're good at. And the only way that you can tell is by asking someone with more experience, give me a problem to work on, right? And you will learn a lot and you get a lot of feedback. And I think that actually is applicable, to all of us.
Wow, I think that's really two great advice for people who listen, right? So I love the first one as well, like kind of summarize the kind of leaders you should be, right? The important attributes, and especially like the walking thing, right? Because some leaders are kind of like detached from the day-to-day workers, employees, right? And they kind of like think it's easy to do a lot of stuff, right? Because think about the layoffs that are happening, because they think by introducing AI they can just replace people, but sometimes it's not as easy as that. So Jean, if people love this conversation, they would love to connect with you or ask you more questions, is there a place where they can find you online?
Absolutely. I'm on Twitter at RealGeneKim, and the other place I love being on is LinkedIn. So just Gene Kim. Just Google Gene Kim vibe coding, and you'll find me.
Right. And I would recommend people to check out Jean's book, right? Vibe Coding. I think it gives a very good overview of what is important, especially these days when people can, vibe code, generate code a lot. And I think there are important lessons, especially the engineering practices that I find very, very important for people to learn from that book. So thank you again for your time today. So it's been a pleasant conversation. Thank you so much for writing the book as well.
Oh, Henry, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this, and keep up all your amazing work.